and tell us all about it. Tell us what you think. Okay?
Thank you, Rolf.
So.
Way to get me off guard there. Thank you. That was certainly not good for my ego, I can say. Thank you so much for having me, and it's an immense pleasure to be here. Like Rolf, this is one of my favorite events to be in. You know, I really, my fingers really scratch when I walk around and get to actually touch the technology that I so often talk about, both in the private sector with the leaders that I get to consult, or in the public sector with the politicians. I also get to nudge in both a more futuristic perspective and as well, for the topic of today, in a sustainable direction. Dare Disrupt, what we do briefly, we do work with the future. Our way with working with the future is drawing out immense and inspiring visions together with our partners. We do that not so much for trying to foresee and having this crystal ball, whether this future will actually occur or not. That's quite uninteresting to me. What excites me is how these visions about the future create actionable results and different behaviors in the present. Does that make sense? And how the more inspiring or the more brave visions about the future we have, that actually also the braver actions we see today in organizations or in society. And that's what I think is exciting about working with the future. And technology is at the very, very center. It excites us. It really is one of the most powerful tools to leapfrog very tedious debates, which are some of often the very tedious debates that I have, let's say, in the European Commission, trying to make people agree on a vision. I can throw technology in there, and it provokes and it inspires, and we really can get to work much faster by showing provocative technologies. And I will show some of these provocative technologies today, but you're also experts in this field. So I'm going to more aim towards this perspective where I'm going to hone in on the intuition side of things. Not so much what these technologies do today, but how they can contribute to writing inspiring visions. And sustainability is really going to be something that I roam around a lot throughout this talk. So I was here 2 years ago. Let's just, before we move into the future, see what happened the last 2 years. And a lot of things did happen. As a woman, one of my favorite things to be on tech spaces is there's never a line to the toilet, usually. But that has actually changed this year. Much more women. And actually a little line occurred earlier this morning over at Hall F, which was exciting. So more diversity in the tech space I've seen. And it's not just women, it's backgrounds, it's nationalities and culture. And this diversity is really at the core for how we write visions and how we drive innovation. But something else has changed, and it's really about the ethics of technology. I can show you videos like this, right? And we're kind of like, yeah, we've seen those robots. 2 years ago, we were in this tech fetishist era of technology where we saw these robots and how fast they develop. Indeed, they develop really fast. But we're kind of, we're excited about them, but it's a different debate today. They're still cool, right? We still like them. This was from last week, still cool. But what has happened now, and particularly in the Nordics and Denmark, taking a huge claim. Boston Dynamics, they should really look at what's going on in Denmark on the robots thing. This is really world class. But on the more ethics around technology, this is a huge thing that happened. And so I'm going to give a little bit of more systemic before we go into these visions. This was a huge milestone happening. The world's first tech ambassador, Kasper Klinge. This is Denmark claiming this role that technology is actually something more. It's about politics, it's about power. And it's not only engineers in this space anymore, it's political scientists. And we should deal with these superpowers just like we deal with states. And what we're touching upon here is actually trying to change the history of technology, where we use technology to create immense growth through the first, the second, and the third industrial revolution, to seeing that, well, this growth has been a bit unequally spread. We have the US on the top, Europe, and then Asia, and then Africa. And whilst we're talking about exponential technologies, there are socio-economic trends that are equally exponential and equally important to work with. And this is something that I believe the Nordics, in particular Denmark, is trying to change, how to build redistributive technology by design. And then we have another thing from the country where I'm from, Sweden. This young lady with just a very simple technology actually, just a hashtag, gathering people from just last year sitting outside very alone to today millions and millions and millions of girls and children. So again, a very diverse space, certainly moving a political debate thanks to technology, but also wanting to really change the history of technology, not only from this social perspective, but from this climate perspective. So also from the third to the second, to the first industrial revolution, how we've used technology to exponentially deplete our resources. Last year, maybe you read the IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Yeah. It created this huge media battle, and also something that is really driving policy around climate finally. And what I think is really exponential is Mother Earth. I call her the master of exponentials, showing us that if we go for 2 degrees in the Paris Agreement, we'll have ices that melt every century, or sorry, every decade, and we kill virtually all our corals. At 1.5, we only kill somewhere between 70% and 90% of our corals, and all our Arctic ices melt only once a decade. Now this is truly exponential, the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees. And if we really go under the hood, this is some tools that you can bring with you if you're going to claim tech for climate innovation. Victor Nolay wrote this book showing how we've exponentially depleted our natural resources. So this is quite small text, so I'm going to just go through some of these depressing curves before we go into the fun visions. How we've exponentially used paper, water use, population exponential, damming of rivers, transport, motor vehicles exponential. Over here we have McDonald's restaurants, also exponential if anyone's interested. And here on this side, much more the the biosphere number, where it gets really depressing. Here we have the CO2 concentration, NOx emission, SOx emission. We have global biodiversity extinction, exponential. Our oceans ecosystem depleted, exponential, etc., etc. Now let's hone in on these depressing curves. How does it feel? Depressive, kind of, checking in, yes. But this is also what now is steering technology. And I think we're at this breaking point where 2 years ago, or maybe 5 years ago, when we looked at these robots or the exponential technologies and kind of this tech fetishism excitement, we didn't really focus on the problem to solve. And now we have a huge problem to solve. And the engineers maybe worked on this problem, but the politicians really didn't. And finally now, also the politicians are getting technological intuition. So the EU is moving fast on sustainable taxonomies for finance, which means that all of the operations that somehow are dealing with fossil fuels per December this year are going to be claimed unsustainable. So the financial market is going to move. These are some of the policies that I've been part in developing. And then we have the European Investment Bank that proposes a total ban on fossil fuels. Total ban from the public sector. Or the fastest ever passed legislation in the European Union is the the ban on single-use plastics, which is coming into force 2021. The most fast-tracked policy ever in the history of European Union. So why is this happening? They're just listening to Greta? No, they're starting to see that this problem is actually having a solution. And I think that the reason that we're finally talking about climate in the way that we do is that this tech fetishist era that we were through gave us hope that actually we can deal with this problem. And so just 2 months after the IPCC report came out last year, the World Bank claimed pulling out all of the finances from coal plants. Did you read this news? Hands up if you did. No? The media doesn't really focus on good news, but that's the separate talk. This was the most amazing news, my favorite news, in 2018, where the World Bank pulled out all their funding in coal plants. Why? They're altruistic? No way. The technology is finally cheap enough, and it says in their statute, because we are required by our bylaws to go with the cheapest alternative available, renewables is now the cheapest alternative. So now we're starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel. So the economics and the technology is following these policies, and now it's going really fast. So let's just double click on solar, one of the most hopeful cases. So here, if you were investing in solar and you would listen to International Energy Agency, which are claiming they're the experts in this field, they have unfortunately not had this technological intuition. They forecasted a linear development in how we extract polycrystalline that goes into these panels, etc., etc. And every year, their assumptions were linear, if you want. So every 2 years, they had to adjust their estimation upwards because the fat blue line is actually the installment capacity of solar. And just 2017, their latest estimations keep being linear. Isn't that fascinating? So we need to also start playing with new playmates that dare to think these brave visions and that trust the technological process, but mostly trust the human ingenuity and that people, problem solvers like engineers and us alike, that we want to develop this technology because there is a huge problem to solve with it. But there's more happening here. We have this amazing, let's say, solar now competing with fossil fuels, cheaper than fossil fuels. But now what obsesses me is that we not just put in them in the existing boxes, in the existing value chains. But what we hear from the IPCC report is that we need radical solutions. They say this several times, radical, quote unquote. This means that we need to change business models, we need to change value systems, we need to change how we relate to products as customers. And therefore, if you're in this space, you really need to play with new playmates. And the ones that are successful are guys like this one, right? He knows everything about software, and the energy market is moving from being a resource to being a software. He knows everything about artificial intelligence. And here's the next trick about tech intuition. We need to understand how a technology converges with other technologies. This is where the magic happens. So if we take solar, it's solar combined with AI, because we can't just have solar. When the sun isn't shining, we need wind when the wind is blowing, etc. So we need powerful software and software skills to be able to forecast a mixed energy portfolio. And we need software to be able to deal with a decentralized energy system. So radical shifts here, and new playmates are the ones that are going to win. Or we need to look at energy as being not a utility, but retail. So ubiquitous, maybe even transparent. Here we have transparent solar energy using UV light to actually have it maybe in our screens, on our phones, embedded in everything. Or foldable solar screens, 3D printed foldable solar panels. Or we will have convergence with 3D printing and blockchain technology to enable an energy industry that isn't B2B or B2C, but C2C, peer-to-peer, where we have citizens that start to trade and actually care about the energy. Because if they have solar on their roofs, they can actually start to trade that with their neighbors. We're seeing systems where neighbors trade maybe 30 minutes of solar for an hour of babysitting with their neighbor. You get to choose, and you get to define yourself. Now we're starting to change with values, and that's where it's interesting. Because energy, we just pay the bill and we don't want to know about it. Maybe now we're starting to choose green energy, but here is a radical new value shift that is interesting. We start to think about our consumption in a totally new way. Or we have a crossing with carbon capture. Now this is the dream that we're going to save everything with carbon capture. We're not. But a lot of interesting things are going to happen with this space, and it's a mix of different technologies. 10 billion tons of CO2 we have to capture every year, so we're bound to have to follow this technology closely. And also here, the Nordics is positioning itself quite interestingly, so definitely a space to follow. Or I think this is my favorite at the moment. Solar energy crossed with space technology. Solar is one of the fundamental technologies that enable space exploration. But we're at a crossroad now where it's not about moving out in space as much. We're finally starting to turn our cameras back on Earth, using satellite data to be able to forecast and in real time govern CO2 emissions, or ammonia emissions, or natural resources extraction. And listen closely, this data is open source. In EU, you have the Galileo program, open source data, anyone can access. And so space is not for NASA or ESS anymore, it's for everyone to access. And this is going to be interesting to put the real climate deniers or climate thieves to justice. We're starting to govern from space, triangulating open source data. Just between 2021 and 27, we're going to have 17 billion euros of money in EU available for space innovation. Go get that money. So that was a lot of info on these creative crossings. What I've talked about is, in essence, what we like to call a three-step model for working with technology. This moving from a linear to an exponential space. We're kind of starting to get that with digital technologies. We're kind of getting that. But now we need to go into these creative crossings, how we combine digital technologies together. So if you're a 3D printing expert, you want to see how that combines with other technologies to change values. This climate space doesn't have to be about not eating meat or never flying. It can be a serious upgrade to our life as well as giving up certain things that we thought we were allowed to consume. It can be a serious upgrade to our life. Let's take another example, 3D printing, which actually is my favorite technology and how I got into tech. The shoes I'm wearing are not 3D printed yet, but they are actually made of ocean plastics. These are shoes that are enabled by technology to gather the plastics in the ocean. And these are shoes that are sold out every single time, and they're the most expensive shoes in Adidas, except for the 3D printing ones. They're $2,000. These ones are about 200 euros. Now, this seems very natural now that I'm wearing plastic shoes and I really gather from the oceans. But imagine pitching this to the board about 5 years ago when they had to start designing for them. Imagine going to the board and saying, I'm going to gather trash from the ocean, and people are going to stand in line to get them, and they're going to pay premium price to buy them. Now, in order to thrive in this space, you have to really embrace the ridiculous. So, bear with me a little bit. We're going to embrace a little bit of the ridiculous. Maybe some value shift that are ridiculous, but I think that are going to happen. Again, to put some emphasis on these creative crossings. So Adidas is now changing how we relate to both the home, as well as the store, as well as the factory. They are investing in 3D printing to such extent that they want to have 3D printers in the store. Now the store becomes a factory. By 2023, 10% of all their shoes will be 3D printed. That's about 30 million pairs. But the crossing here that's interesting is 3D scanning. You come in, you get your foot scanned, and hours later, have your shoe printed. Now, that thing of going into a store and they say, I'm sorry, we don't have it in your size, you're never going to hear that anymore. It's always going to be in your perfect size. So that's the crossing with 3D printing, 3D scanning, and AI. And then next, do we even have to own those shoes? If the factory is so close to our home, why not have a Spotify for shoes? Right? You just go in whenever there's an upgrade to your shoe, you hand in the old shoes, and because they're printed in one and the same material, fully enabled for circular economy. Now we're moving from a volume-based economy to a value-driven economy. We're starting to decouple growth from environmental draining. Does that make sense? Yes, I'm seeing some nods. I'm happy about that. And the product is starting to act like a software, always in continuous development, right? Here we have a young man talking with an AI-powered topology optimization software tool, and he doesn't have to be an engineer. And imagine getting products updated, just like you have a software update on your phone, always in continuous development. Products developing in a spiral, not in this linear where we push out mass-produced parts or products, standing in huge inventories, and then nobody really wants them. Or maybe here we really have some changing values when it comes to how we start relating to matter and to Mother Earth. That producers now have to think like gardeners. With 3D printing, we grow products, just like nature have perfected over millennia. We grow products, we don't take a block and subtract. But we also start to think, what if products can develop with time? If we know how a material corrodes with time, instead of using that as an enemy, let's use that as a strength in our design process. And so 3D printing is obviously so last year. Now it's all about 4D printing. And the fourth dimension is time. So we have this plastic that self-assembles when it comes into contact with water. We see concepts of water pipes that expand when they're contact, when there's a lot of water in the system, or become smaller when there's less water running through the system. We start seeing also products that instead of thinking that we need to use as little as possible material, we're also thinking, what if every product was a gift to nature? What if every product was climate positive? Here, a plastic bottle that after 60 days is actually serving as fertilizer to the soil. We can actually throw it out. Feels a bit wrong, but here it actually is a gift to nature. Or we have a student from Delft University that 3D prints the silk cracker, and there's yeast in it and there's seeds, and after 4 days you have mushrooms and herbs growing out of it. This is certainly thinking like a gardener, which is the major value shift that I see amongst producers. We have to start playing with biologists, with artists, we have to play with chemists to a totally different extent than we did before if we are producers. Here on the very top, you have to play with artists. This is an artist that is using nanotechnology powered 3D printing to print little statues on hair straws. Right? We know we can control to the atomic level. Okay, so we unfortunately have to have an overview of all these technologies, and the intuition is about what happens when we cross them. Not one in silo, but the crossing. Are we feeling like this? A bit overwhelmed? Is it okay? This is honestly how I feel all the time. So I'm going to try to hone in on certain tools and ways of thinking that might empower you to navigate this overwhelming and fast-moving space. And it's actually one of the most powerful questions that I try to answer is not everything that has changed in 10 years, but what is still important. That's the most interesting question. Many things will change, but what will remain? And I honestly think, and I'm sure you agree, sustainability and climate innovation is still relevant in 10 years, increasingly so. So it's a safe bet to start retrofit our operations accordingly. But when I, 2 years ago, was asked by the Vice President of the European Commission to write the vision for European industries by 2030, super daunting task. Because again, I don't know what's happened in 2030. What I did was to go back to my school books, what I had been taught, the old doctrines, the old rules, and with the technology that I knew, what was possible, try to see what are the most dominant rules that I will try to change, regardless of the technologies that will help me change them. What I ended up with was 10 commandments. And these are my rules, because I'm a political economist by background. And you have different backgrounds and different rules, but maybe this could be a way of thinking of guiding principles that will help your innovation, that will help who you innovate with, and with what technology. See, I was taught that the economy was top-down planned, that the value chain was linear and global. I was taught that products was about profit, and then climate change was this externality that we deal with later. With the technologies that I know are at hand today, we can finally have a bottom-up economy, We can stop thinking about buyers and sellers. We can think in terms of prosumers, that I am my own producer and consumer, and that we need to enable a space for bottom-up co-creational design, and that products are always going to internalize the cost of climate change. If we don't start doing it now, somebody will have logged into the open source satellite data and look at our operation at a factory and say, hey, you're not doing good enough. We can use big data and AI to actually have science-based policies. This is one of the major things that I've been working on, science-based policies in the climate space. Only that alone means that the price of carbon is going to increase with 300%. Now, how does that impact your operations? Start already playing with science-based economic mechanisms. But also, I was taught that products was about ownership, but now it's going to be much more about access. And I was taught that wealth was something that we took in and distributed by default, a central authority that takes it in and then distribute. But now with technologies like blockchain, we're seeing wealth distributed by design. And then maybe a little bit philosophically, but have you ever been told that your life is a journey? Hands up if you have. Yes, great. Well, that might be true. I like to think of my life much more as a dance, right? I don't really know where I'm going. A journey has a destination. And if my journey is that corner, I can just run over there. But when you dance, you listen to the music, the problem to be solved right here and right now, and you focus on new dance partners who you like to dance with. And that's a much more intuitive exercise and way to start thinking about our work. And this is really where disruption, I believe, is at the core. Disruption is about solving one problem here to create more value. We change something in the old to create more value in the new. And when I'm done solving that problem, I can move on to the next problem to solve. So moving from selling products every quarter, every year, to solving problems. But if I told you to change everything you're doing right now just to do this 10x or dancing strategy, it would be really irresponsible, because there is no long term if there is no short term. So here is the balance exercise, to balance the old and the new. To know that yes, as we move from a volume-driven to a value-driven strategy, we need to ourselves plan this death, because most of our are designed to a volume-based economy. And if we use these technologies to save, let's say, 10% every year in our current operations, that's fine, as long as we use these to plan for tomorrow's strategy. So if you use 3D printing to do prototypes faster or products a little bit smarter, that's fine, as long as you use the money that you gain in your tomorrow strategy. And that's how I think that you can balance both secure a long term whilst protecting the current. And it's all about what value shifts do you bet on? What do you believe? Playmates. I did touch upon that a little bit. And I think that is going to be key, and also why this day today is so important. Those that are not in this room are those that I look at on a Monday morning if the coffee hasn't kicked in and I feel super linear and I don't believe the world is exponential. This is my sort of guilty pleasure. I go in on internetlivestats.com and I literally, in front of my screen, whilst waiting for the coffee to kick in, I'm saying hi to all the new people that get access to the internet. This is with a couple of hours of delay. We passed the 4 billion mark in terms of minds connected to this internet, where ideas are shared freely, where technologies are being accessed at a decreasing cost. And this is an exciting space to be in. And we, future people, we think that we're going to have 2 billion people more connected to the internet within 4 to 6 years. 2 billion more minds with solutions to problems we didn't even know existed. So certainly an exciting space, and artists or new playmates for you to talk to. And if we don't do it, we risk having these incremental innovations, like going back to climate, are unfortunately not going to save us. So this house is cool. It's a Chinese 3D printed house. They printed 10 houses in 48 hours. It's cool. It solves, in certain places in the world, a housing problem. But China has used as much cement the past 4 years as the US has done in a century. So this is not going to be enough. And this is where the upgrade comes, the fundamental upgrade. I'm dreaming of a day where we live in these sea scrapers. These are designed by Vincent Callebaut, a Belgian architect, and I think more actually an artist, who say, well, rising oceans, we might have to adjust to that extent that we will leave 2,000 people in each sea scraper. We will have aquaponic systems, and we will be docking into our own sea scrapers here with our boats and have the communal areas here. We will be chilling with the orcas in our communal spaces. Now again, I don't know if this vision will be true or not, and what excites me is really thinking about, well, what does happen when we live with orcas? Another thing, have you heard thinking outside the box? Hands up if you have. Yes. And how can we think outside the box if we live in them? Now maybe we're starting to create new neurons when we live around orcas, and our creativity will really spur to such extent that it really isn't possible today. So the climate space doesn't have to be all about sacrifice. It can also be about dream, a serious opportunity to dream about radically new way of living. Because unfortunately, we will have to radically change. But it doesn't have to be that bad. Now, before I round off, and I think there's time for some questions, I certainly made time for that. I'm going to leave you with 3 dares to really power you a bit further if I can. The first one is about disrupting me. Again, I said disruption is just about problem solving, and what I'm trying to create is this positive and thrilling vision about climate innovation. And when I'm done with that problem, I can move on to a next problem. So by emailing me, you'll be having my slides, and you can do this for me and with me, adjusting the presentation as you see fit, moving the conversations with your colleagues and families and friends, thereby helping me move on to a bigger problem to solve. You can disrupt yourself, and this is about talking with new playmates here today. Maybe talk with some biologists or artists, if there are some, or next fair, maybe you choose a conference that is totally outside of what you normally go to see if there are some creative crossings there that might be interesting for you. And we sit in Copenhagen at Nørrebro. We have an open door policy. I'm often here and I'm often everywhere, but what I really want help with is this thing that is so tough, even for us that work with this on a daily basis, is to define your business by problem solved, not product sold. When, not if, but when you crack that nut, you email me again or you come by and we'll have coffee, because I want to know about all your tips and tricks for doing that. So finally, let this be a metaphor on this problem solving, not product selling. Don't design me a house, design me something I can live in, or better yet, dance in. Thank you. And I hope some good questions will come out of it. Thank you.
I think I have sound, yes? Okay, so it's your turn. Questions for Märtha?
Yes.
There's one there. Oh, that's good. And you'll get a mic.
Okay, hi, thanks for the talk. You talked a bit about market forces and you yourself working with regulation. So going forward, how do you see that balance developing?
How I see the market mechanisms change with regulations?
Yeah, or what will guide us to be more green and more sustainable in all these changes? Is it market forces? Will it be regulation? Which will have the greatest effect?
I hope a combination of the two, because we need this perfect balance between the creativity that comes hopefully from the market, but the constraints that come from policy top down. If we have too much, no constraint at all, we don't get any innovation. So we really need to have a little bit of the whip combined with the carrot, and I do think that a lot of the whipping could come from policymakers, and it's just it shows in the policies. But it's a good constraint to work with. Just again, thinking about the CO2 going up 300%, the cost of CO2, how just intuitively does that change the way that you relate to your operations? Maybe back to you, if that's... No. All right. I think a combination. It's I think when you're dealing with such a big problem, you can't deal with policymakers alone. You have to work with all of them combined. And obviously, working with policymakers for me is like a draining source. Took us 2 years to figure out whether to have climate neutrality in our vision or carbon negative. Like it's slow processes. So have also at the same time your market players that can give you hope and excitement, your partners in crime that drives the innovation. That was everything answer to you. You can talk more afterwards.
And I think you should do that, so you are around, and
I am.
And people can
I
connect.
am.
Okay, more questions.
There was a question somewhere.
I think you're difficult to ask questions because you try and take in everything and build it into something. But there's a question.
Oh, good.
Okay, I have a question about dancing.
Yes.
When you talk about dancing, I mean, you can on the one side have sort of what you would call standard dancing, like rumba or tango, where you have predefined rules of dancing, and in the other end, you will have sort of, if you go to a techno party and jump up and down. So what kind of dancing are you really talking about?
Oh, I love that question. I've never thought about it before, but actually, I think it's a combination of the rules and sporadic, intuitive or impulsive dancing. Because those commandments that I had, those are my rules within which to dance. And then I can jump from, meddling with 3D printing or AI or a different actor or dance partner, as long as I feel that those rules help me. They help me which clients I work with, Is this going to help me to distribute wealth by design? Or is this going to help me to internalize the cost of climate change? How we do it, which dance, I don't really care actually. It depends on the partner, I guess. That was great. I never thought of it like that. Thank you.
Interesting. Okay, so I'm looking at you.
All
More
right.
questions from Märtha. I think you have...
In the back, I think.
In the
yes.
back.
Good. Thank you.
I have a question because I'm thinking that what you are talking about is for the 20% of the population that is very interested in how to dare and disrupt. How do we get the rest of the 80% who are sitting with their hands? How do we motivate them to become in this journey?
That is the question that keeps me up at night and where I don't have an answer at all. Besides, what I'm currently working with is we need visions that inspire. So I've worked with the Sustainable Development Goals. Those are 17 colors, and those are 139 sub-criterias. Or the vision with the EU that we work with, it's a heavy text with fancy words. That doesn't move anyone. The SDGs are moving a lot, but still only in the 20%. So my hypothesis is working with the arts. I explore working even with an instructor at the moment on a Netflix series that is kind of Black Mirror in reverse, positive visions. And it's not to be propagandic or fool people. Like the climate space is, we have to do radical stuff. But I think that we can move the rest if we show that this is a serious upgrade, that how we relate to nature is going to increase our happiness. This is what I think, and I hope to translate that through the arts.
And
But let's talk more if you have some tips and thoughts. It's a tough one.
There are places on Earth where people are very poor and resources are very limited.
Yes.
So going along those lines, they will, if you met them, they would ask you, I need to survive, I need to support my family, I need to do ordinary stuff, and I really don't care about your SDGs because I really just need to make something for me.
Exactly.
How do I work with that? How do you work with that?
That's about listening much more than telling, because the innovative force that do exist, so a lot of the spaces that I look at that inspire me are actually in the global south. How people in the total different part of the world are using technology. There is an immense innovative force, actually. But it's true that the climate innovation space has different faces. for us is like a luxury product at the moment. We do it because there's kind of profit for it, and we're kind of feeling climate anxiety about not going to Malaga or wherever. But in the other place in the world, it has a totally different face and about life and death. And we're going to see technologies being applied in totally different ways. So these visions will have to be very diverse, for sure.
I think we have room for maybe 1-2 more questions.
That's a
And
great
there's one there.
in the forefront, yes.
And the next in line would come forward.
Do you think that technology is really the solution to all our environmental problems? Because, for instance, blockchain, it consumes a lot of energy.
It really does, and so does carbon capturing. So no, not at all. It's only if we have this proper dialogue in place where we can actually really change markets or customer needs or how we relate to products around us. But it's also, and back to the question, we need to look at, on the finance part of things, how to decouple in absolute terms. And this is something that we haven't been doing, and the industry is only decoupling on the per unit. So, the CO2 per unit. And this is not enough. We need to look at the total volume and the total cost. And there, absolutely, whenever we implement blockchain, we need to really make sure that in absolute terms, we're decoupling growth from the environment. It's, I really don't, like, this is the core question in this space. I do see the development, right? The carbon capturing technology is only possible if we use renewable energy for it. Blockchain is only possible if our data centers are continuing to comprise the data storage as well as using renewable energy. But we always have to have this total cost, and also solar panels are trashing, especially at the moment, many of them. So this is really where we need to work with politicians as well, and always have this right to play whenever we develop a solution. Denmark has an amazing target, right? 70%. So I hope that whenever we bet on a new technology, that it's always with its contract to the government or to the people, that if we do this, we promise we're going to cut this and contribute to the agreement, the Paris Agreement, in such and such way. Yeah, it's a fantastic.
But of course, blockchain technology needs to improve also.
Absolutely, yeah.
So it's not about applying any old technology to and
Yes.
leave that alone.
Yes.
Of course not.
Yes.
But you were really asked, is technology the solution to everything?
Well, and this is where it's interesting. It's kind of, and that's why I started the talk with, we were in this tech fetishist era, and now we're kind of in a very critical era in Denmark, which is great. But now is the time to apply. And we mustn't sit just passively. We have to get to work. And unfortunately, like if I had a magic button, we will all be living in Avatar right now. Honing in with our, hugging our trees. Like seriously, this is my utopia. But we can't, and unfortunately, and we have to put those technologies that are powerful to use, but with the right criteria as always, for sure. So balancing the tech with the intuition for the impact that we can have. Yeah,
All right.
fantastic question. Thank you for that.
So maybe one final question. I'm looking. It doesn't seem like that.
Oh,
so
there's one just final.
Oh yeah. Oh yes. Of course, it's across the room.
Yes, and it has to be cloned.
Thanks. Thanks a lot for inspiring speech. A key question for this radical decoupling, when you're talking about growth, I hear you talking about, complete makeover of our economic, or our capitalist economy and our consumerism.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see this happening without consequences for especially us in the Western world, lowering our living standards?
Also fantastic questions, amazing. I think freedom is becoming thrown up in the air, and what is freedom today? We're at this stage where we're talking about maybe freedom to have a car or have a house is less important than freedom to breathe fresh air. So the ground assumptions in capitalism about freedom for property is kind of being turned on its head, because it's actually more important to have freedom for fresh air, not only for me, but for my future kids. So yes, we're going to turn things around, but I don't necessarily think that it's going to be a huge turnover. Because actually a lot of the models that we've been using up until now, let's take the GDP function, for example. We have all the different things in there to plot in the cost of climate change. We don't have to change the model. It's just because our politicians haven't been good users of the model. They haven't priced climate constraints well enough. So I'm not necessarily thinking a turnover of everything. We just have to be super users of both the technology to price the cost, the real cost of climate change differently. And yes, the rest of us will have to make up with certain perceptions of freedom, but in the thought that, well, maybe it is more important to have fresh air than having 2 cars and 2 houses and eat meat every day. That's my personal belief, but I'd love to be disrupted. And I will be here for the rest of the afternoon, and I really love to talk with you much more. We're having a very weird separation with the thing that I can't hear you, and so let's meet face to face as well.
That's right. Remove some technology.
Yes.
And get closer.
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So thank you.
Thank you, Rolf. Thank you for having me. Great questions. Thank you.
And I'll just say that in 10 minutes, about 10 minutes, we'll look into the future of payments and money.